Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm the Sandman, joined as usual by Alfred Farius. How are you today, Alfred?
I am good, thank you.
Good to hear. Well, after the betrayal at Calth, Rabute Gilliman developed a deep hatred of Gotchahammer. Nevertheless, there are some that still persist in the Codex Astartes today. In this video, we're going to take you through them, as well as through the core abilities that you're going to need to know in order to beat Space Marines. The aim of these videos is to make sure that you don't have to read the entire codex in order to play against these factions. We've picked out the most important rules that you're going to be unaware of without ever reading the book and put them in a digestible format.
So this video is probably going to be a bit quicker than the other ones we've done because there's not as many scary things in this book, let's be honest. I think that's a deliberate decision by Games Workshop to make Space Marines a little bit easier for some of the newer players. The fact that they are good right now, a lot of this comes down to their points efficiency and just how reliable a lot of their units are. Some of the power comes from their supplements and their faction-specific rules, but today we're just going to cover the core Codex Space Marine rules. They do have some powerful characters and strats, and those are the main things that we are going to be going over.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to start us off by talking about the Librarian?
This is the first of several Space Marine characters that can be upgraded, and there are 4 main psychic powers that I think we wanted to cover because they can be the ones that might catch you out. First off, we have Might of Heroes. It increases the attack, strength, and toughness. 2 other powers that affect invulns are Null Zone and Psychic Fortress. Null Zone will take away invulns in a 6-inch bubble, and Psychic Fortress will give an invuln to a friendly unit in a 6-inch bubble. The last power I wanted to mention was Shrouding, which can only be taken for a Phobos Librarian. What that does is, within 18, they can choose a Phobos unit, and they can make it so that that unit can't be targeted by ranged attacks unless it's the closest, which can be really strong for protecting that unit on an objective.
Always worth remembering as well to stay outside of 12 if you're casting psychic powers so they don't get that +1 to deny. I think the key thing you've mentioned here is probably the Null Zone. It's not uncommon for a Space Marine player to throw away a Librarian with a jump pack, for example, in order to take the invuln away from a model like Mortarion or the Silent King. Probably a fair trade in most Space Marine players' eyes. Let's move on then to the Chaplain. I think he's a prime example of what you were talking about at the start, where his abilities aren't going to surprise you. They're very reliable and very powerful. But my favourite one is the +2 to charge, and the reason for that is because a 7-inch charge out of Deep Strike is super reliable. Always worth noting though that this ability does not stack with any other pluses to charge your opponent might have. Up next we have the Reaver Lieutenant, who like the Reavers has a -2 leadership debuff, but he also has access to the Terror Troops stratagem. This is a stratagem that allows him to turn off OBSEC for units within 3 inches of him. It also allows him to stop a unit from performing an action if he rolls over their leadership on 2d6. I think you're going to see him teched into a lot of lists because he's super good, but he also has access to the Lord of Deceit Warlord trait, and if your opponent's taking a lot of Phobos, this is basically a redeploy for 3 of their units, so it's super strong.
And just be aware that if your opponent has a Phobos heavy army, they could be deploying in the middle of the board from turn 1.
Alright then, let's move on to the array of incredibly powerful elite characters that Space Marines have access to, starting with the Judiciar. He has an ability to make a unit fight last within 3 inches of him, so do be careful of that. You also can't pay 2 CP to interrupt with that unit, so always be mindful when you're charging a unit that surrounds the Judiciar.
So the other character we want to talk about is the Company Champion, the duelist of the Space Marines. It's worth noting he can heroically intervene 6 if he moves towards a character, and he fights first if he's fighting another character.
Yeah. Brilliant. And we don't see him that much now, but I'm going to guess there's a Primaris Company Champion on the way someday, so maybe we'll see it then. Up next, I guess is a Chief Apothecary. He doesn't really do much. He's basically just kind of a white tactical marine.
Next up is the Ancient. He's the guy holding the big banner. So when a friendly unit dies within 6 inches of him, they can either shoot or fight with 1 attack on a 4-up. You can upgrade him to a Chapter Ancient, which gives you access to the Warlord trait Steadfast Examples. And with this, you can give core units within 6 objective secured, and if they already had it, they count as 2 models. Now it's worth noting that these core units could be Terminators or Dreadnoughts, so really tough to shift off those objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And they even have another Warlord trait called Rights of War, and this does basically the same thing.
Next up, we have the first unit we wanted to talk about, the drop pod, which is, we think, the only unit that can deep strike in turn 1. This can be particularly strong with Devastators, who have a withering amount of firepower, especially when you can make one model +1 to hit, and with that same model you can make him shoot twice with the Cherub, and the +1s from the Signum. Pretty strong.
Yeah, got to accept that. Strong firepower turn 1. Yeah, so like Alfred said at the start, most of their other units don't have a crazy amount of special rules. They're going to surprise you. The suppressors can turn off Overwatch. The eliminators can basically fire and then move again. But most of them are pretty simple. They do, however, have combat squadding, and this allows a big unit to split up into 2 smaller units at the start of the game. So be careful of that when choosing your secondaries.
So let's talk about some of the stratagems available to Space Marine players. There are a few things here that might catch you out if you're not aware. First off, let's talk about some of the things that intercessors can do. So now rapid fire is the only way to get shoot twice with Marines at the moment, and it can only be done on intercessors. Similarly, the only way to fight twice is with assault intercessors with Honor the Chapter. Next up, we've got Auspex Scan. When a unit comes down, an infantry Marine unit can shoot at them within 12-inch range. So be careful when dropping down near Marines if you want to do any sort of charging shenanigans.
And whilst it's not technically shooting twice, with steady advance, you're effectively getting twice the number of shots because it counts the unit as standing still. And with bolter discipline, this means that you'll double your shots with rapid fire bolt weapons. Up next, we have the infamous transhuman physiology. This means that you can't be wounded on a 1 to 3. It's going to determine a lot of your games versus Space Marines. And last we have the suppression fire ability. If your opponent's got 1 whirlwind in their list, this is why they've taken it. It makes a unit fight last and it turns off Overwatch. It's super powerful.
Other things to take note of, with Phobos units they have guerrilla tactics, so they can go back into strategic reserves as long as they are more than 6 inches from an enemy. So late game, a Marine player might use that to jump on a backfield objective. Next up they have only in death does duty end. That allows a character to fight on death as long as he hasn't fought yet. This means that if there's a scary character that you thought that you killed when you fought him in close combat, he can still kill you back, so watch out. Also there are tremor shells. If they've taken the Thunderfire cannon, that's why they've taken this. So that can half move characteristics for units hit by it, and also -2 from advance and charge rolls.
Up next we have adaptive strategy. This basically means the unit counts as in every doctrine, and this is big for 2 reasons. A, it can be massive on a unit like a Redemptor, which can benefit from all 3 doctrines, but also it means if your opponent's super doctrine has effectively ended by this point because you've moved on, actually your opponent can get back into it with 1 key unit if they so choose. And then also, Reavers can shock and awe your units, and this means they can turn off their Overwatch and make them -1 to hit.
Marines also have a few ways to do some mortal wounds to your units. So if you've got a unit that has Melter Bomb keyword, they can do for 1 CP 2d3 mortal wounds to a vehicle, pretty strong. Or if you have infantry with heavy bolters, they can do Hellfire shells for 1 CP, d3 mortal wounds. And similarly, infantry with missile launchers, they can do Flak missile, so 1 CP for another d3 mortal wound.
Then we have hit and run warfare, which means bikes and land speeders can fall back and shoot for 1 CP, and we have Hammer of Wrath, which means that jump pack units can do mortal wounds also on the charge.
Some Marines do have a few defensive stratagems, so they have Grav Pulse, where repulsor units can shoot and fall back, and there's -2 to charges if you charge a repulsor unit. And then Smoke Screen, so any vehicle with a Smoke Screen keyword, once they're shot at, they can get -1 to be hit. Or Skilled Riders, which is another -1 to be hit, but this one is for bikers or land speeders.
We also have Armour of Contempt, which is a 5-up feel no pain against mortal wounds for vehicles. We have Unyielding in the face of the foe, and this means that Gravis armour units can get +1 to their armour save against damage 1 weapons, finally making them the Primaris Terminators that they always wanted us to be. And that's taken us to the end of this video, which is shorter than the other videos we've done for the reasons Alfred mentioned earlier. However, as Alfred also mentioned, a lot of the power of the Space Marines right now comes from their chapter specific rules. So we're going to be going through those rules too, starting over the next couple of weeks. So we'll see you for those videos. Thanks very much for watching and happy hobbying.